golden glow of chandeliers bathed La Couronne in an ambiance of quiet sophistication. Nestled in the heart of Manhattan, the Michelin-starred restaurant was a favorite among the city's elite. Politicians, CEOs, and socialites who considered fine dining not just a luxury, but a birthright. Tonight was no different. The soft hum of classical music played in the background, mingling with the gentle clinking of wine glasses and murmured conversations. Servers in immaculate uniforms gilded between tables, presenting plates of filet mignon, truffle risotto, and the restaurant's famed lobster bisque. Everything was pristine, flawless, just the way Victoria Langford liked it. Before we dive into today's story, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting update. Victoria entered La Couronne with the confidence of a woman who had never been told no. Dressed in an elegant emerald green gown, her diamond bracelet shimmered as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Heads turned as she passed, but she barely noticed. She was used to admiration. She was here to celebrate, though not out of joy. That afternoon, she had finalized the acquisition of a boutique fashion company, forcing its struggling owner into bankruptcy. Business is business, she had told herself, signing the papers with a smug smile. And what better way to toast her victory than with a glass of Chateau Margaux at her favorite restaurant? But as she approached her usual corner table by the window, her expression darkened. Someone was sitting there. Her usual spot, taken. A muscle twitches in her jaw as she turns sharply toward the host, a nervous young man in a neatly pressed suit. "That's my table," she said, her voice dripping with entitlement. "I'm so sorry, Miss Langford," the host stammered. "But tonight, the owner requested that we keep it reserved for another guest." "The owner?" she scoffed. "Since when does the owner dictate seating arrangements? I've been dining here for years." "I truly apologize, ma'am. We have a wonderful table near the entrance." "Near the entrance?" Victoria's lips curled in disgust. "Like some common tourist?" Before the host could stammer another apology, she waved him off. "Fine," she snapped, striding toward the table in question. "Just send a waiter over, and make sure he's competent." Settling into the chair, she crossed her legs and glanced around impatiently. A few minutes later, a waiter approached. Tall, neatly dressed in a crisp black uniform, his posture composed. Victoria didn't bother looking at him. Instead, she snapped her fingers. "Finally, bring me a glass of Chateau Margaux, and make it quick." "Of course, ma'am." But the waiter replied smoothly, his voice calm. Victoria sighed, already annoyed. If only she knew how this night would end. Victoria tapped her manicured nails against the table, irritation creeping into her expression. The La Couronne staff was usually flawless in their service, yet tonight there was a noticeable delay. She glanced at her watch. 5 minutes had passed, and there was still no sign of her wine. She turned sharply as the waiter returned, a single glass of Chateau Margaux balanced expertly on his tray. "Finally," she muttered, snatching the glass. She took a sip and frowned. "This tastes off. Are you sure you poured from the right bottle?" The waiter met her gaze with unsettling composure. "I assure you, ma'am, that is our finest Chateau Margaux, aged to perfection." Victoria narrowed her eyes. There was something about his tone, controlled, almost as if he were amused by her complaint. She glanced at his name tag. "Daniel." "Listen, Daniel," she said coolly. "I don't pay a fortune to drink something questionable. Fetch me a new glass, and this time, make sure it's actually from the right bottle." A flicker of something unreadable passed through Daniel's eyes, but he nodded. "Right away, ma'am." Victoria exhaled sharply, turning her attention to her phone. Her notifications were flooded with messages from associates congratulating her on the takeover. She smirked, typing a response, when a sharp clatter. Her eyes darted up. A waiter, one of the younger ones, had tripped, sending a plate crashing to the floor. Gasps rippled through the restaurant. The young man looked mortified, bending down to clean the mess. Victoria rolled her eyes. Pathetic. Daniel reappeared with her fresh glass of wine. As he set it down, Victoria's lips curled in disdain. "Honestly, does anyone train the staff here anymore? That clumsy boy just ruined the ambience of my evening." Daniel's expression remained unreadable. "Accidents happen. Not in my presence," she snapped. "I swear, the standards of this place are slipping. I should speak to the owner myself." Daniel tilted his head slightly. You'd like to meet the owner? Yes, she scoffed. Clearly, he needs to be reminded who keeps this establishment running. Daniel hesitated, as if considering her words. Then he nodded. I'll see what I can do, ma'am. Victoria smirked in satisfaction as he walked away. Maybe now she'd finally get the level of service she deserved. Minutes passed, and her mood soured further. The restaurant buzzed around her, but she was trapped in her own bubble of irritation. What was taking so long? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden shift in atmosphere. The restaurant doors swung open, and a man in an expensive tailored suit stepped inside. Heads turned as he entered, not just because of his striking presence, but because everyone recognized him. Everyone except Victoria. The restaurant manager hurried toward the man, shaking his hand. The head chef emerged from the kitchen, offering a respectful nod. Even the hostess, who had fumbled in front of Victoria earlier, straightened her posture, eyes wide with admiration. Victoria frowned, watching as the man spoke with Daniel. Their conversation was brief. Then, to her utter shock, Daniel turned and walked toward her table. Not as a waiter, but with the same commanding presence as the man who had just arrived. Something was wrong. Victoria's stomach tightened as Daniel stopped in front of her. He reached up to his collar, slowly unfastening the small, rectangular name tag pinned to his shirt. Then, with deliberate calm, he placed it on the table in front of her. A slow smile spread across his face. I'm glad you wanted to meet the owner, Miss Langford, he said smoothly. Because here I am. Victoria's breath hitched as Daniel's words settled in. The owner? Her mind scrambled to make sense of the revelation. Just moments ago she had dismissed him as a mere waiter, someone beneath her notice. Now he stood before her, exuding an effortless authority she had completely overlooked. A sharp wave of embarrassment coursed through her, but she forced herself to maintain composure. This must be some kind of joke, she scoffed, tilting her chin up. You're Daniel, the waiter, not the owner of La Couronne. Daniel's smirk deepened. I was a waiter tonight, yes, but only because I like to personally assess how my staff is treated by certain patrons. His dark eyes gleamed, and Victoria felt a sudden unwelcome heat rise to her face. The realization hit her like a freight train. He had been testing her. Well, she huffed, crossing her arms in an attempt to regain control. If you were looking for flaws in your restaurant, you certainly found them. The service here is declining, and if you want to maintain your reputation, I suggest. I'm not looking for business advice, Miss Langford, Daniel interrupted smoothly. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet power that made her fingers tighten around her napkin. I already know how to run a successful empire. Victoria bristled. Is that so? Daniel leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough that only she could hear. Yes, and I know the kind of woman you are too. Victoria's pulse quickened. Excuse me? Entitled, Daniel continued, his voice dangerously soft, demanding, used to getting her way, and most importantly, utterly blind to the power dynamics in the room. He tilted his head slightly. You thought you owned this place the moment you walked in, didn't you? That your status, your name, gave you control over the people around you. Victoria stiffened. No one ever spoke to her like this. But you didn't see me, did you? Daniel's expression remained infuriatingly composed. You dismissed me, just like you dismissed that young waiter for making a simple mistake. Because in your world, people are either beneath you, or they don't exist at all. Her fingers clenched against the table. She should have been furious, insulted, ready to call security. But instead, an unfamiliar sensation twisted inside her, a feeling she wasn't accustomed to. Unease. And yet, Daniel mused, straightening up. Here we are, and for the first time tonight, Miss Langford, you are not in control. Victoria swallowed. She hated the way his words dug under her skin, the way they forced her to confront something she had spent years avoiding. A quiet stillness stretched between them. Around her, the restaurant had resumed its usual hum of conversation, waiters moving in seamless harmony. Yet, for Victoria, the world had narrowed to just this moment. Just him. She could feel eyes on her now. The very people she had dismissed without thought were watching, judging. A flicker of panic gripped her. Victoria Langford was never caught off guard. She opened her mouth, searching for a cutting remark, something to regain her footing. But before she could speak, Daniel took a slow sip of the very wine she had so arrogantly dismissed earlier. Then, with deliberate ease, he set the glass back down, leveling her with an unreadable look. "You're welcome to stay and enjoy your meal," he said smoothly. "But something tells me you've lost your appetite." And with that, Daniel turned and walked away, leaving Victoria sitting there, for the first time in her life, at a complete and utter loss for words. Victoria sat frozen, her pulse thrumming in her ears. The weight of Daniel's words lingered like an echo she couldn't escape. The clatter of silverware, the low murmur of conversations, the dim glow of candlelight, all of it blurred into the background. She had always prided herself on control, on her presence, her influence. Yet here she was, sitting alone at an elegantly set table, feeling something she never had before. Exposed. She reached for her wine glass, but her fingers trembled. She clenched her jaw and pulled her hand back, her mind replaying the last few minutes. Daniel had walked away effortlessly, leaving her in the wreckage of her own arrogance. The staff, the very people she had ignored or berated, were still moving about. None of them rushed to accommodate her anymore. There were no stolen glances of admiration or fear, only quiet acknowledgement of what had unfolded. Victoria shifted uncomfortably, the room suddenly feeling too small. She wasn't used to this, being overlooked, being put in her place. Her gaze drifted toward Daniel, who now stood near the bar, effortlessly conversing with a group of guests. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't waiting for her reaction. That realization unsettled her more than anything. For the first time in years, Victoria felt the sharp sting of irrelevance. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to think logically. So what? So what if she had misjudged him? So what if she had been embarrassed? She had built her reputation on resilience, on always staying a step ahead. Then why does this feel different? A quiet voice inside her whispered the truth she didn't want to admit, because Daniel hadn't just called out her behavior. He had seen her, and that was far more terrifying than being dismissed. Taking a steadying breath, Victoria smoothed her napkin against her lap. She wouldn't leave, not like this. A waiter approached cautiously. "Miss Langford, would you like?" "No." Her voice was softer than she intended, but she straightened her posture. "I'd like to settle my bill." The waiter hesitated before nodding and disappearing. Victoria's gaze flickered back to Daniel once more. He was laughing at something another guest had said, completely unbothered. She realized then, this wasn't a game to him. He hadn't put on a show to humiliate her. He had simply spoken the truth and moved on. And maybe that was the worst part. Minutes later, the bill arrived. Victoria signed it with a practiced ease, but as she stood, she hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Then, with quiet dignity, she walked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Just as she reached the door, she heard a familiar voice. "Miss Langford." She turned slowly. Daniel stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, she thought he might offer a parting remark, some final sting to seal the night. But instead, he simply dipped his head slightly in acknowledgement. A silent understanding. Victoria hesitated, then, to her own surprise, returned the gesture with a nod of her own. Then she stepped out into the night, the cool air hitting her skin. For the first time in years, she wasn't quite sure who she was anymore. And she wasn't sure if that was a good or bad thing. Life has a way of humbling even the most powerful. It is easy to believe that success, wealth, or influence grant immunity from consequences, but the truth is, no one is above basic human decency. Victoria Langford spent years building her empire, wielding her authority without question, and expecting the world to bend to her will. Yet, in one evening, with a few simple words from someone she once considered insignificant, she came face to face with a reality she had long ignored. The moral of Victoria's experience is clear. Respect is not commanded by status, but earned through character. No amount of power can shield a person from the truth. Daniel's calm yet honest confrontation forced her to see herself through a different lens, one that was unfiltered, raw, and deeply unsettling. It wasn't just about how she treated people. It was about how she had allowed her success to strip away her humanity. People often mistake authority for respect, but they are not the same. A person may obey out of fear, but true respect comes from kindness, understanding, and fairness. Victoria's downfall in that moment was not losing face in front of a room full of people. It was the realization that her influence had no meaning when stripped of fear, that those around her had never truly admired her, only tolerated her. Another key lesson is that growth often comes from discomfort. When we are confronted with our flaws, we have two choices: reject the truth and continue unchanged, or embrace it and strive to be better. Victoria, for the first time in years, felt something she wasn't used to: irrelevance. But within that moment of discomfort lay an opportunity. The question wasn't whether she had been wrong. It was whether she would allow herself to change. This story also highlights the importance of standing up for oneself and others. Daniel's quiet confidence and refusal to tolerate disrespect was a reminder that no one should be afraid to speak the truth. Sometimes the most powerful message is not delivered with anger or cruelty, but with clarity and unwavering self-respect. Finally, self-awareness is the foundation of true strength. Victoria walked away that night not defeated, but transformed. For the first time, she wasn't entirely sure of herself. And that was a good thing, because in that uncertainty lay the possibility of change. True power doesn't come from status or wealth. It comes from the ability to learn, to grow, and to treat others with dignity, no matter who they are.